The mining colony on the edge of the frontier was not the kind of place anyone would call welcoming, yet it had its own rhythm, a life built on routine, long hours, and survival. The lodging hall, with its dim lights and recycled air, was where most workers ended their day, gathering to eat, drink, and exchange stories before returning to their cramped quarters. Ryan, a human mechanic whose hands were permanently marked with oil stains and the faint smell of burnt wiring, entered the hall that evening in search of a hot meal after spending hours repairing faulty generators in the dust-choked tunnels. He expected nothing unusual. The hall always looked the same dull buzz of conversation, the same clatter of cutlery, and the same faint hum of machinery running in the background. But tonight, there was someone sitting apart from the usual groups, someone who changed the air the moment Ryan noticed her. Kalira sat alone at the far end, her tall frame casting a shadow that stretched across the wall behind her. Her kind, the Velari, were known for their height, sharp features, and piercing eyes that seemed to weigh and measure everything they saw. Even when seated, she looked imposing, her armored plates glinting faintly under the pale light, her claws tapping the metal table in a rhythm that hinted at both boredom and unease. The other miners kept their distance, whispering from the safety of their tables, glancing at her as though she were a dangerous predator that might lash out at any moment. For Kalira, this was nothing new. She had spent her life walking into rooms and watching them empty, feeling the weight of stares that were a mix of awe and fear. She had long stopped expecting anything different, so when Ryan walked in and his gaze landed on her, she waited for the usual, a quick look away, a nervous shuffle, or perhaps the subtle widening of eyes that said he saw her as a threat. Instead, Ryan surprised her. Without hesitation, he walked to the counter, ordered his food with a calm tone, and then turned toward her table as though it were the most natural thing in the world. His steps were steady, his expression relaxed, and when he reached her table, he simply nodded in greeting before setting down his tray. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, not in the quivering voice of someone forcing bravery, but in the casual manner of a man asking for a seat in a crowded hall. Kalira tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing in suspicion, her body tensing as if she expected a trick. She did not answer right away, and in the silence, Ryan slid into the seat across from her, unfazed by her hesitation. He unwrapped his meal, a simple ration plate of protein blocks and heated stew, and began eating as though dining across from a towering warrior alien was nothing unusual. The whispers from the other tables grew louder, the miners exchanging glances, as though they were watching a reckless man walk into the lair of a beast. Kalira could feel their eyes on her, and for a fleeting moment she considered baring her teeth just to reinforce the fear they already carried. But then she noticed Ryan again, chewing thoughtfully, his eyes occasionally meeting hers without flinching or darting away. His gaze was steady but not challenging, curious but not mocking. She could not remember the last time anyone had looked at her like that. "You are not afraid," she finally said, her voice low, carrying the weight of someone who was used to being feared. Ryan shrugged slightly, stabbing at the last piece of his protein block with his fork. "Should I be?" he asked, his tone even almost playful, though not disrespectful. Kalira leaned back in her seat, her armor plates clicking softly with the motion, studying him as though trying to unravel his thoughts. Most humans avoided even walking near her species, yet here he was, eating calmly, speaking to her like she was no different from anyone else in the hall. It unsettled her, though not in the way she expected. She had faced enemies who charged at her without hesitation, soldiers who thought bravery was enough to bridge the gap between species. This was different. This was not bravery, at least not the kind she recognized. This was a kind of acceptance she could not understand, and it stirred something unfamiliar in her chest. She let the silence stretch, her sharp eyes locked on him, waiting for the moment his mask would slip and he would reveal the fear she knew must be there. But Ryan kept eating, unfazed by the growing tension, as if he had shared countless meals in stranger company. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. "Food's not great here," he said lightly, gesturing toward his tray. "But it's better than going hungry. You haven't ordered anything?" His question was simple, yet it carried a weight Kalira was not prepared for. She had not eaten since arriving at the colony, partly because the food was unfamiliar and partly because she had no desire to endure the reactions that came when she tried. She frowned slightly, unsure how to respond, but Ryan did not press. Instead, he pushed his tray slightly toward her. "If you're hungry, you can have some." His words were casual, offered as if it were the most natural thing to share food with someone, but Kalira felt her chest tighten. No one had ever offered her something so simple in such a direct way. Her first instinct was to refuse, to remind him that she was not some fragile creature in need of kindness. Yet the smell of the food reached her, and the hunger she had been ignoring clawed at her stomach. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out, her clawed hand hovering over the tray as though unsure if this was truly real. Ryan did not move, did not flinch, did not pull the tray back. He simply watched her with calm eyes, waiting. Kalira picked up one of the ration strips, studied it for a moment, and then took a bite. The taste was plain, but it filled her empty stomach, and she chewed carefully, her sharp teeth slicing through the food. She expected him to react, to recoil at the sight of her eating, but when she looked up, he only grinned faintly. "Not so bad once you get used to it," he said, as though nothing about this moment was strange. Something shifted inside Kalira then, something she could not name. For so long she had lived behind walls of suspicion and fear, expecting only rejection or terror from others. Yet this human had sat down across from her, shared a meal, and spoken to her as though she were simply another worker in the hall. She found herself wondering why, and the not knowing made her uneasy in a way battles never had. Around them, the whispers continued, but Kalira ignored them for the first time in years. Her eyes stayed on Ryan, searching for answers in his steady calm, and though she did not yet understand him, she knew this encounter was different. Something had begun that neither of them fully recognized, and the quiet bond formed over a shared meal carried a weight that might one day change more than either of them expected. Kalira remained at the table long after Ryan had finished his meal and left for his quarters, her thoughts circling around him in a way she could not push aside. For most of her life, she had been a figure who commanded distance, someone whose presence emptied rooms and stilled conversations. She had worn that reputation like armor, believing it was the natural order of things for a Velari warrior to inspire caution, even dread in others. But now, for the first time, that certainty cracked because a human mechanic with oil-stained hands had looked at her without fear and had treated her not as a threat but as a companion to share food with. That memory replayed in her mind as she left the hall, her steps heavy against the metal floor, her sharp features betraying no emotion to the miners who shrank back at her passing. Yet inside her chest, a knot had formed, pulling tighter each time she remembered his calm tone and the way he had smiled as if nothing about her appearance was unusual. She tried to dismiss it as foolishness, but the unease lingered like an echo she could not silence. The next morning, when Kalira entered the main work bay where the miners and mechanics gathered, she expected Ryan would avoid her now that the moment had passed. Most did. They might survive one encounter, but the weight of her presence usually caught up to them eventually. Instead, she found him crouched over a half-disassembled engine, sleeves rolled up, humming a tune as he worked. He looked up as she entered, gave a nod of acknowledgement, and returned to his repairs without hesitation, as though her arrival was no more distracting than the hiss of the ventilation system. That calm acceptance unsettled her more than open fear ever had. As the hours passed, Kalira became aware of the whispers spreading through the colony. Humans and other workers glanced at her, then at Ryan, their hushed voices carrying fragments of disbelief. No one could understand why the human mechanic acted so casually in her presence, and the more they questioned it, the more their fear of her deepened. She heard their words: predator, monster, dangerous, and though such labels were nothing new, she found they stung in a way they hadn't before, not because of what they said about her, but because of what they implied about Ryan. His reputation began to shift as well. Where once he had been seen as a reliable, if unremarkable worker, he was now whispered about as reckless, perhaps even touched with madness for daring to share a meal with the alien warrior. Kalira noticed the sidelong glances directed at him, the subtle way some co-workers kept their distance, and though he seemed unaffected, she could not ignore the unease it sparked within her. For the first time, her reputation of fear was no longer hers alone. It had extended its shadow to someone else, and that realization unsettled her more deeply than she cared to admit. Later that evening, when the work bay had quieted, and most had retired, Kalira found herself drawn toward the sound of steady hammering from a corner where Ryan was still bent over a piece of equipment. She approached silently, but he must have sensed her presence because he glanced up and grinned. "Could use an extra pair of hands if you're not busy towering over people," he said lightly. The remark was teasing, yet it carried no malice, and she blinked in surprise at his ease. For a moment she hesitated, her instincts telling her to keep the wall between them firm. But curiosity won out. She crouched beside him, her large hands careful as she held the engine casing steady at his instruction. Together they worked, their movements falling into a rhythm that surprised her with its natural flow. He explained his methods in simple words, showing her how he approached repairs, and though much of it was unfamiliar to her, she listened closely, finding the human's perspective oddly grounding. When the engine finally sputtered to life, Ryan gave her a satisfied nod. "Not bad teamwork," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. Kalira looked at the glowing machinery, then at him, and for a fleeting second she felt something shift inside her, something dangerously close to pride. That night, she returned to her quarters unsettled, but not by fear. Instead, she grappled with the strange pull that Ryan's presence created. His lack of fear had unsettled her at first, but now it was becoming something more, something that stirred questions she could not silence. Why did he treat her as though she belonged among them? Why did his calm carry weight when even her own people rarely looked at her without judgment? She had faced countless battles, endured wounds and hardships, but nothing had prepared her for the quiet, disarming strength of a human mechanic who acted as if her presence was nothing unusual. Yet even as she struggled with these thoughts, she could not ignore the storm gathering beyond her personal conflict. The colony was a place of fragile order built on routine and unspoken rules, and Ryan's refusal to treat her as a threat had disrupted that balance. Whispers grew louder, suspicion sharpened, and she began to sense that both of them were standing on the edge of something that would not simply fade away. The following day, when Kalira walked into the hall again, she saw the miner's eyes flicker between her and Ryan, who was already seated with his tray of food. She expected him to stay silent this time, perhaps bowing to the pressure of the crowd, but instead he gestured toward the seat across from him. "Hungry?" he asked simply, his voice cutting through the whispers like a blade through cloth. The hall fell silent, every ear tuned to her response. For a heartbeat, Kalira considered walking away, retreating into the safety of solitude, as she always had. But then, remembering the calm steadiness in Ryan's gaze and the way he had treated her as though she belonged, she crossed the room, her footsteps heavy, and sat down across from him. The whispers turned into stunned silence, the tension in the room thick enough to press against her skin, but Ryan continued eating without concern. Kalira's sharp eyes scanned the hall, daring anyone to challenge this moment, and though no one spoke, she could feel the fear rising. She realized then that the reputation she had carried for so long had become something more dangerous now, because it was no longer hers alone. It was beginning to wrap around Ryan too. Yet even as unease settled in her chest, she felt a spark of something unexpected. Suspense hung in the air, not just for those watching, but for her as well. She had always believed she understood her place in the world, but this human was changing it, piece by piece, with every calm word and fearless act, and though she did not yet know where this path would lead, Kalira sensed that the story was only beginning, and the shadow of her reputation was about to shape both of their futures in ways neither could predict. The days that followed changed the rhythm of the colony in subtle but undeniable ways. Kalira noticed it first in the way conversations faltered when she entered a room, or how the miners quickly shifted their gazes to Ryan whenever she passed. It was not just fear anymore. It was curiosity wrapped in suspicion, like the entire colony was waiting for something to snap. Ryan, as always, appeared unconcerned, moving through his tasks with the same steady patience. But Kalira could see the small changes, the way his co-workers avoided sitting too close, the way some withheld tools or information, as if testing how far his unusual friendship with her would go. At first, Ryan brushed it off with an easy smile, telling her not to worry about what people thought, but Kalira knew better. Humans were social creatures, and to be set apart from the group was a burden, even if Ryan pretended otherwise. The colony thrived on unspoken rules. Everyone kept their head down, did their work, and never stirred trouble. By refusing to be afraid of her, Ryan had disrupted that fragile order, and now the cracks were starting to show. One evening, as the sunless skies of the mining world pressed down with their constant storm clouds, Ryan returned from the work bay later than usual. His uniform was dirtied with grease, his hands marked with shallow cuts, but his smile was still there as he carried a box of spare parts into the lodging hall. Kalira was waiting near the entrance, having lingered there longer than she intended, and though she told herself she was only curious, the truth was harder to ignore. She wanted to see if he was unharmed. When he noticed her, he gave a casual nod, as if her presence was no different from the tables or the lamps above, and the simplicity of it disarmed her again. But then she caught sight of the figures behind him. 3 miners lingering near, the far wall watching him with narrowed eyes. They did not look at her directly, but their stiff posture and hushed voices told her everything. These were not glances of fear, they were glances of resentment. It was not her they wanted to confront, it was him. That realization gnawed at her long after Ryan disappeared into his quarters. She had lived most of her life under the weight of isolation, armored by her reputation. But Ryan was human, and humans did not bear such isolation easily. She began to sense a shift brewing among the workers, one that could turn dangerous if left unchecked. The colony was small, its people bound together by routine and necessity, and in such places, anything different was often treated as a threat. Ryan's refusal to keep his distance from her was slowly marking him as an outsider, and outsiders rarely fared well in communities this fragile. Kalira found herself torn, uncertain whether to intervene or to step back, because both choices carried risks she had never faced before. If she tried to shield him, she might only worsen the hostility he faced. If she did nothing, she risked watching him become a target of their resentment. The tension grew clearer the next day when she entered the work bay. Ryan was already there, focused on repairing a damaged drill unit, while several miners stood nearby whispering to each other. Their voices were low, but Kalira's sharp hearing caught fragments. Reckless, dangerous, doesn't belong. The words burned at her ears, and for the first time she felt a flicker of anger not for herself but for the human who continued working without acknowledgement of the whispers. She wanted to step forward, to silence them with a single glare, but she stopped herself. If she did, it would only confirm their fears, that Ryan had allied himself with the very monster they dreaded. So instead, she stood at a distance, watching as Ryan tightened the final bolts, wiped his hands clean, and gave the machine a gentle pat as it roared to life. He turned, caught her watching, and gave a small, unbothered smile. To him, perhaps it was nothing more than another day's work, but to Kalira, the quiet weight pressing against the colony walls was impossible to ignore. That evening, a storm swept over the colony, its winds rattling the outer panels and its lightning flashing against the darkened sky. Inside the lodging hall, the workers gathered for their meals, their voices raised louder than usual to mask the sound of the storm. Ryan sat in his usual place, and once again, the seat across from him remained empty until Kalira stepped inside. The room fell silent, the storm outside momentarily forgotten as she crossed to him and sat without hesitation. The whispers started immediately, sharper than before, like knives scratching at the air. Ryan, unfazed, offered her a piece of bread from his tray and spoke about the machine he had fixed, his voice calm and even. Kalira listened, but her sharp gaze scanned the hall, reading every glance, every narrowed eye, every muttered word. The colony was turning, and she could feel it in her bones. It was not long before the first confrontation came. A few nights later, as Ryan was leaving the work bay, 2 miners intercepted him in the corridor. Kalira, returning from a patrol, heard their raised voices and approached silently, her steps masked by the hum of machinery. She arrived just in time to hear one of them hiss, "You think you're clever, siding with her? You'll regret it when she turns on you." Ryan's reply was calm, almost casual. "She hasn't turned on me yet. Maybe you've all been wrong about her." His words carried no fear, only quiet certainty, and the silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Kalira stepped into view then, her towering frame casting a long shadow across the corridor. The miners froze, their faces pale, and without a word they retreated down the hall. Ryan gave her a small nod of thanks, as if this kind of encounter was nothing worth troubling over. But Kalira knew better. The colony's unease had boiled into open hostility, and though this incident ended without harm, it was a sign of what was to come. That night, as lightning flashed outside and the wind howled against the walls, Kalira lay awake in her quarters, her mind restless. She had thought herself immune to the fears of others, but now she found herself tangled in them, not for her own sake, but for his. Ryan's calm had shielded him so far, but even calm could not withstand the weight of a community ready to turn against him. Suspense pressed against her like the storm outside, a warning that choices would have to be made soon. For the first time in years, Kalira felt something close to dread, not because of what might happen to her, but because of what might happen to the one human who had refused to fear her. The storm outside had passed, but within the colony, the storm was only beginning to build. The halls that once hummed with steady routines now carried a sharper edge, the kind that made silence feel heavy and words feel dangerous. Kalira sensed it in the way the workers moved, no longer merely avoiding her but circling around Ryan as though he carried something contagious. It was not simple fear anymore. It was resentment shaped into suspicion, and suspicion into quiet planning. Ryan himself seemed unbothered, his calm nature shielding him like a second skin. But Kalira could see the subtle signs he refused to admit, the way his eyes lingered longer on the doors before stepping into a crowded hall, the way his hands tightened around his tools when a group of miners drew too close, the way his smile faltered just for a moment before he set it firmly back into place. She understood then that he was not blind to the hostility. He was choosing not to give it power. But choice or not, the cracks in the colony were widening, and every day they grew deeper. It started with the small things. Tools Ryan needed began to disappear, only to be found hours later misplaced or hidden. Instructions left for him contained mistakes, small enough to appear accidental but large enough to cause setbacks. In a place where precision meant survival, these mistakes could easily turn into disasters, and Kalira knew better than to believe in coincidences. Ryan, however, brushed it aside with an almost stubborn lightness, telling her it was nothing. He couldn't fix, but she saw the tightening of his jaw each time it happened. The colony was not just testing him anymore, it was pushing him. And though Kalira had spent her life brushing aside the slights of others, she found herself feeling something unfamiliar when it was aimed at him. Anger. Yet anger would solve nothing. If she confronted them directly, she would only confirm their growing belief that Ryan was a traitor to his kind, siding with the very creature they distrusted. The balance was delicate, and she realized with unease that their survival here depended not just on machines and rations, but on trust, and trust was crumbling. The true breaking point came during a routine inspection of the western mining shafts. Ryan had gone ahead with a small crew to check the stability of the supports after the last quake. Kalira was stationed nearby as part of her patrol, though the others pretended not to notice her. The ground shuddered once as they worked, the tremor light but unsettling. The miners muttered among themselves, their eyes darting to Kalira, as if blaming her presence for the instability. When Ryan called out a warning about a crack forming in one of the lower beams, his voice steady but urgent, the others hesitated. "It's fine," one of them snapped, unwilling to take his word. Ryan ignored the dismissal and moved forward, inspecting the structure himself. Kalira, watching from the shadows, saw the faint shift in the rock above. She stepped forward, her voice sharp as she commanded them to pull back. For a heartbeat, no one moved until the ceiling groaned and a fracture split across the stone. In that instant, Ryan shoved one of the miners clear and dove aside himself as the beam came crashing down. Dust filled the shaft, shouts echoed, and, when it cleared, Ryan stood coughing but unharmed, his warning proven right. But instead of gratitude, the miners' expressions hardened. One of them spat words laced with venom. He only saw it because she was there. He's her eyes now, not ours. The accusation cut through the air sharper than the falling beam had cut through stone. Ryan, still brushing dust from his sleeves, looked stunned but did not argue, and that silence was enough for the suspicion to take root. By the time they returned to the surface, whispers were spreading like wildfire that Ryan and Kalira had orchestrated the danger to make themselves seem necessary, that their strange bond was a threat to the colony's unity, that humans who trusted aliens always met ruin. Kalira knew how quickly whispers could grow into blades, and she could see it already happening in the wary glances, in the way groups huddled closer when she passed, in the way conversations fell quiet the moment Ryan entered the room. That night, the colony felt colder than usual. The storm outside had left the air damp and heavy, but inside the walls, the chill came from something else. Ryan sat in the lodging hall, his food untouched, staring into the distance with a frown he tried and failed to hide. Kalira joined him, the room once again falling silent at the sight of them together. She leaned forward slightly and asked if he was all right, her tone quieter than usual, and for the first time his answer was not the easy smile she had come to expect. "I knew they didn't trust me," he admitted softly. "But now they're starting to hate me. And I don't know how long I can keep pretending it doesn't matter." The words sat heavy between them, heavier than the storm clouds that gathered outside the dome. For Kalira, it was a strange moment, one where the walls she had built around herself felt fragile, where she realized that this human who had defied fear was now the one in danger of being broken by it. She wanted to tell him she would protect him, that his calm had given her strength, and now she would return it. But the words caught in her throat. Protection was not enough. This was not a battle that could be fought with strength or with silence. This was a battle of perception, of fear, of loyalty. If the colony turned fully against him, even she could not shield him from the weight of their unity. Yet doing nothing would mean watching him be crushed under it. Suspense pressed harder against her chest than any storm ever had, and she knew a choice would soon come. One that would decide not just his place in the colony, but her own. For the first time in years, Kalira felt the uncertainty of a path she could not see clearly, and the realization was as unnerving as it was inescapable. And so, as the night stretched on and thunder rolled once again beyond the walls, Kalira remained awake, her gaze fixed on the door of Ryan's quarters. The colony was no longer just cracking, it was splitting. And in the silence between the storms, she wondered how long before the fracture became irreversible. The days following the mining shaft incident felt like a slow tightening of invisible chains around Ryan's life, each link forged from the cold suspicion of those who once worked beside him. And Kalira could feel the walls of the colony itself turning hostile. It was not an open confrontation. No one shouted, no one dared to accuse him directly where the records might capture their words. But the silence was sharper than blades, the kind of silence that turned hallways into battlegrounds, and every casual glance into a quiet accusation. Ryan began to notice the subtle ways in which he was being cut away from the rhythms of daily life. He would arrive at a worksite only to find the job already done without him, his expertise no longer welcomed. He would sit down at the mess hall and the benches would empty slowly, deliberately, until only Kalira remained. Even the tools he used seemed to betray him. Requests for parts went unanswered. Maintenance schedules for his machines went missing from the logs, as if the colony had collectively agreed to erase him piece by piece. Kalira had lived long enough to understand what this meant. It was not exile declared, but exile enacted. A quiet removal from the fabric of their world, until he would stand alone on the outside whether he wished it or not. What troubled her most was not the isolation itself but the way Ryan bore it. He tried to meet each slight with the same half-smile, tried to keep his voice even and his humor alive. But Kylira saw how the spark in his eyes dimmed a little more each day. He was a man used to being relied upon, to being the one others turned to when machines failed and systems broke down, and now he was being treated as though his presence itself was the problem. That quiet erasure hurt him in ways he did not admit. And Kylira realized that even the strongest spirit could be hollowed out by loneliness if it was given enough time. She tried to stay close, though she knew her presence only deepened the rift between him and the others. Still, she would not abandon him, not when he had never flinched from her shadow the way everyone else had. One night, as the artificial lights dimmed across the colony and the corridors echoed with the distant hum of machinery, she found him sitting alone in the lodging hall, the glow of a small maintenance lamp casting shadows over his face. In front of him lay a broken tool, one of the simplest devices in the colony, something any worker could repair in minutes. Yet he had been staring at it for over an hour without lifting a hand. Kylira stood silently for a long moment, watching, before finally crossing the room and sitting across from him. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "It's not the tool," he admitted, not looking up. "It's me. They don't need me anymore. They've decided I don't belong here, and the worst part is I think they're convincing me too." The words struck something deep inside her, a place she had long kept buried beneath duty and strength. And for the first time she saw not the human who had defied fear but the man who was close to breaking. She told him firmly that belonging was not something given. It was something taken and defended. She reminded him of the shaft, of the warning he had given that saved lives, of the countless small repairs he had done without recognition, and, though her words were meant to steady him, she knew they were also a promise to herself that she would not allow his spirit to vanish into the silence. But the colony was not easing its grip. In the days that followed, rumors sharpened into quiet plans, and Kylira overheard fragments of conversations when the others thought she was too far to listen. Words like transfer and petition and safety carried the clear suggestion that Ryan's removal was no longer an unspoken hope, but an approaching action. They would not banish him outright. That would be too obvious, too direct. But they would pressure the command council until he was reassigned to some outpost far from Klyros, far from her. The thought burned in her chest with a heat she could not name. And for the first time she considered what it would mean if she had to choose not just between her people and him, but between the order she had sworn to uphold and the bond she had not expected to form. The tension grew heavier with every passing hour, until even the air in the colony felt hard to breathe. And still the storms outside battered the dome, as though the world itself reflected the fracture within. One evening, after another day of cold shoulders and unspoken accusations, Ryan returned to his quarters only to find the door sealed. His access code had been stripped from the system. No explanation given, no note left. He stood there for a long time, the hallway empty around him until Kylira appeared and quietly guided him to her own quarters. He resisted at first, unwilling to make her share the cost of his exile, but she silenced him with a look and told him there was no exile she would not share. That night, as he lay on the narrow bunk meant for a soldier twice his size, staring at the ceiling while Kylira kept silent watch at the door, the reality of his isolation became undeniable. He was no longer just unwanted. He was being erased, and the only tether he had left was her. For Kylira, the decision crystallized then. If the colony sought to push him into the shadows, she would step into them beside him, no matter the cost. Yet in the quiet, as the storm howled faintly beyond the walls, a single question gnawed at her. How far was the colony willing to go to remove what it feared? And how long before whispers turned to something more dangerous than silence? The slow isolation that Ryan had endured finally began to transform into something heavier, a pressure that could no longer be ignored, as the colony leadership made their move with a precision that revealed just how long the plans had been forming behind closed doors, and Kylira sensed it first. noticing the way guards shifted their patrol routes to pass more frequently near Ryan's presence, the way conversations hushed more quickly when he entered a room, and how his name began to appear in reports that had little to do with him at all, as though the colony were building a record of his supposed failures. Small incidents twisted into patterns that painted him as careless, reckless, even dangerous. For a man who had spent his life solving problems with machines and logic, the weight of suspicion that ignored truth and bent reality against him was more suffocating than the storms that hammered the dome outside, and yet he bore it with a quietness that unsettled Kalira more than his anger would have. One evening, summoned before the command council, Ryan stood under the harsh white lights while officers recited a list of grievances, tools gone missing, schedules disrupted, even the shaft collapse reframed as his fault for interfering with systems beyond his expertise. He tried to explain, to remind them of the warning that saved lives, but his words fell into silence like stones dropped into an endless void. The council did not shout or accuse. They spoke with polite formality, but behind their words was a verdict already decided. Ryan was to be relocated, transferred to an outpost far from Klyros for his own safety. For Kalira, the moment was not merely an insult but a breaking point, because she could see clearly what they refused to admit, that this was not safety, but removal, an attempt to push away what unsettled them, to silence the only human who had dared to stand calmly in a hall where even her presence drew fear. The announcement spread quickly through the colony, not in shouts or cheers, but in the subtle sigh of relief that moved like a current, a quiet acknowledgement that the problem would soon be gone. Yet what none of them expected was Ryan's reaction, for he did not protest or fight. He nodded, thanked the council for their concern, and left with the same unshaken expression that had unnerved Kalira the day she met him. But behind that calm, she saw something else, a resolve taking shape, a decision that would not bend to the colony's will. Later, when they sat together in her quarters, he confessed in a low voice that he had no intention of leaving, not because of pride or stubbornness, but because abandoning Klyros now, with its unstable power systems and the cracks that had already begun to form in the dome, would mean abandoning lives to disaster. He could not do it even if those lives turned their backs on him. Kalira felt a surge of conflict then, torn between the loyalty she had sworn to the chain of command and the loyalty she felt to him. But as she looked at him, the decision became clear. Duty meant nothing if it demanded silence in the face of truth. That night she swore quietly that she would stand beside him, not as a guard obeying an order, but as an ally making a choice. The breaking point came only days later, when the storms outside struck harder than they had in years, and the colony's power systems buckled under the strain. Lights flickered, alarms echoed through the corridors, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the unstable hum of the energy core deep below. Ryan was the first to understand the danger, the readings flashing across his datapad telling him that the fail-safes were moments away from collapse. But when he rushed to the control deck, the guards barred his path, insisting he had no clearance. Kalira arrived seconds later, her presence cutting through the hesitation of the soldiers, and with a single command she brought him inside. Ignoring the stares of the officers who demanded explanations, Ryan didn't waste time. He sprinted to the consoles, hands moving over systems he had studied in silence for months, and the council that had condemned him now watched in silence as he tried to stabilize a failing machine that could tear the dome apart. Sweat streaked down his face as warnings blared, and every second felt like an eternity as Kalira stood guard behind him, facing the officers whose anger rose with every keystroke he made. The dome shuddered as the storm battered. It and Ryan's voice cut through the noise, sharp and certain. If we don't vent the excess power, the core will overload in minutes. But the council refused, citing risk to the outer settlements, and Kalira saw the fury in Ryan's eyes. Not fury for himself, but for the blindness of those who preferred silence over truth. She stepped forward then, her voice louder than she had ever allowed it to be, declaring that she would take responsibility, that the vent would open with or without their permission. For a long heartbeat, no one moved, and the only sound was the wail of alarms and the storm's rage pressing against the dome. Then, with a single decisive motion, Ryan triggered the vent, sending a surge of energy blazing out into the storm beyond, a beam of light that lit the skies and shook the colony to its core. The overload subsided, the hum of the core steadied, and the dome held. Silence followed, heavy and absolute, as the reality of what had nearly happened settled over them. Ryan stood, his breathing ragged, and Kalira positioned herself between him and the officers who were already shouting for his arrest. But the people had seen. They had felt the tremor, heard the alarms, and now they understood that the man they had shunned was the one who had saved them. Yet Kalira also knew this was not the end. The council's pride had been wounded, their authority defied, and they would not forgive so easily. The breaking point had been reached, not only for Ryan, who had finally refused silence, but for the colony itself, which could no longer pretend that fear was strength. And as Kalira looked at him, standing tall despite the weight of every gaze in the room, she realized that whatever storm came next, it would not only test the walls of the dome, but the fragile threads that bound trust, loyalty, and truth together. The storm outside had finally eased, but inside the colony, another storm was brewing. One made not of wind or thunder, but of voices raised in fear and anger, as the council gathered to decide Ryan's fate now that his defiance had saved them all, yet humiliated their authority. And the people were divided, some whispering that he had done what no one else could, others muttering that a human had no right to act above command. Ryan stood silent in the middle of it all, his arms folded, not from arrogance but from weariness, because every word thrown at him reminded him that truth was fragile when pride was threatened. Kalira remained by his side, her towering figure, a silent shield against the storm of accusations, and though her instincts urged her to act, she knew that this moment would shape the colony's future more than any battle or storm. The council accused Ryan of reckless endangerment, claiming his choice to vent the energy could have destroyed the outer settlements, but the data on his pad, still glowing faintly, showed the reality, that without that decision, the core would have gone critical and the dome itself would have fallen, killing them all. Yet the council did not want to see numbers or facts. They wanted control restored, order reasserted, their voices heard above the truth. The choice before Ryan was cruelly simple: submit to transfer, leaving the colony in silence, or remain, and face exile, perhaps even imprisonment for daring to act without approval. For a moment he considered the first option, because the weight of endless resistance pressed heavily on him. But then his eyes met Kalira's, and in her gaze he found no doubt, only certainty that leaving would mean betraying the very lives he had fought to protect. When his turn to speak came, the hall quieted, not from respect but from curiosity, and Ryan's voice, steady though tired, filled the chamber. He did not argue for his innocence or plead for forgiveness. Instead, he spoke of what he had seen since arriving at Kleros, the cracks in the systems, the blind faith in technology, the fear that turned every question into insult. He told them plainly that survival was not found in pride or in silence, but in listening, in adapting, in facing storms together instead of alone. His words carried no flourish, no attempt to soften truth, and that honesty cut deeper than anger ever could, leaving the room in a silence thicker than the storm clouds above. Then he stopped, not asking for agreement, but leaving the weight of his choice for them to feel, because in truth the decision was not his alone anymore, it was theirs. Kalira felt the shift before anyone else, a subtle tremor in the crowd as murmurs rose, not accusations this time, but uncertainty, and she realized that Ryan's greatest strength was not the knowledge of machines, but the courage to speak plainly when others hid behind titles and fear. Yet the council, bound by pride, refused to yield, declaring that his presence had divided the colony, and that order demanded his removal. But this time their words did not land as they once had, because too many had seen what Ryan had done. Too many had felt the dome tremble and known who had saved them. It was then that Kalira stepped forward, breaking her silence, her deep voice carrying through the hall like the strike of a hammer. She declared that if Ryan was to be cast out, then she would leave with him, not as a gesture of rebellion but as a matter of truth. because she could not call herself a protector if she abandoned the one who had acted when others would not. Her words struck harder than Ryan's, because Kalira was no outsider. She was a commander of their own, a warrior bound by oath, and her loyalty to him was a wound the council had not expected. More voices joined then, hesitant at first, then stronger. Miners, engineers, workers who had been saved in the shaft collapse, who remembered the human who treated them not as pawns but as people. And soon the hall was no longer a chorus of accusations, but a tide of voices rising against silence. The council tried to push back, but their power was slipping, their control unraveling in the face of a truth they could no longer deny. And in that moment the colony reached its choice, to cling to pride and fracture, or to accept the unity offered by the very human they had tried to silence. The decision came not in a single vote or decree, but in the quiet breaking of the council's authority, as one by one their supporters turned away, leaving them standing isolated at the front of the chamber. Ryan did not smile or celebrate, because he knew the path ahead was not victory but burden, heavier now that eyes looked to him not with suspicion but with expectation. He turned to Kalira, and in her steady nod he found the strength to face what came next. The colony would need rebuilding, not its walls or machines, but its trust, its way of choosing truth over pride, of listening even when the voice was not their own. That night, under the weakened but still standing dome, Ryan stood on the platform, overlooking the storm-swept horizon, the air sharp with the scent of ozone, and Kalira stood beside him, silent but resolute. They did not speak of triumph or defeat, only of what lay ahead, because survival was no longer a question of weathering storms, but of making the choice, again and again, to face them together. And though the future was uncertain, those storms would surely return, Ryan knew one thing with unshakable clarity, that on a world where silence had nearly cost them everything, his voice and Kalira's strength had broken through, and that was enough to carry them into whatever came next.